Well, welcome everybody to GRA's property market update with Simon O'Connor from Sentinel Planners. Tonight's all about the RMA and changing planning rules. And I'm just having a wee chat to Simon while everybody jumps online. But I thought I'd do a quick intro. Welcome, Simon.
Thanks, Matt. Good to be here again.
Just carrying on that chat we were having. So in the last 7 to 10 days, I've been connecting to real estate agents and mortgage brokers and various people at the coalface. And one of the changes that they've said to me is pretty much universally, sort of 80% of the buying is being done by homeowners at the moment. So little wonder that, planning activity is down. And I know for my own affairs, I've been buying sites in the down market as an investor against the market. I've been getting beaten by homeowners. They'll pay more than me for the sites, but where I am getting them, I have no intention of developing them anytime soon, but I am consenting them. And so, as you're aware, because you're my planner, I'm starting in Rotorua planning the heap of sites I've got down there, and I might start construction next year of 1 or 2 of the sites, but I'm going to stack a heap of sites up, and when the market conditions are suitable, then I'll get stuck into it. And the same with my Farringdon Road development. I won't necessarily develop that anytime soon, but I'm planning it. So we're going through the planning process. So I think a lot of developers are like me, recognising that the market is in tough times, very difficult to make developments work when interest rates are so high. Affordability has brought house prices down, and the cost of construction have gone up. So, who's going to take risk in that environment? But it doesn't mean you don't get your ducks lined up and get your planning done and get your consents in place. So that's my pick of what's going on as consents recover. It's people like me planning for the next recovery. Anyway, Simon, a warm welcome from myself and from our viewers online, and welcome viewers back to what is the second webinar in this GRA series of market updates here in 2023. It's August 2023. This evening, we're going to be going over 2 things. Firstly, I'm going to cover sort of 101 basic development terms and zoning examples, and I'm going to try and give context to the town planning process. And then I'm going to bring in Simon O'Connor, who is an expert town planner, and he's going to tell us what's going on with the proposed changes to the Resource Management Act and the planning rules across New Zealand. Now, because this is a GRA event, we are specifically interested in money and how you make money out of these ideas. So no point in having this information if we can't make money out of it. So I will try and commercialise Simon's points as he goes through from myself, my own perspective as a developer, and just try and tease that out of him, because he's a very learned man. He really knows the rules, but sometimes he can be so deep in the rules that you can lose the big picture, which is what are we trying to do. And he'll be giving you a nugget, a nice bit of gold, and so I'll jump in where I can and tease those nuggets out. But I just wanted to start with development terms for those of you that are not active developers. So when you're developing, you've got to apply for your resource consent and your building consent. And when you're doing that, of course, you've got to comply with the zoning in the area that you're working in. So generally residential housing, residential zoning. And within those zones that you're working within, you have development controls. So these are things like your building height restrictions, height in relation to boundary rules, side yard restrictions. So height in relation to boundary is, go to the side and come up 2.5 metres or whatever it is, and then come in 45 degrees or whatever the zone says. And you've got to build within that envelope on the site. And you've got to be a certain distance back from the front yard and from the side yard. You have maximum building coverage, minimum landscaping requirements. You have to have a living court. You have to have outdoor living space off the main room, the biggest door in the main room of the lounge. So all of these controls, which you have to go through and tick, add up to the concept of development controls. And if you tick all the development controls, then in theory, you've got a compliant subdivision or project, and council should rubber stamp it and you go straight through. Now, it's not necessarily true that you have to achieve all of those controls. You can actually breach some of them or even all of them. And if you can persuade council that the site has sufficient amenity, so if it's going to be a nice living environment, then council might say, yep, you can proceed. Sometimes council will say, well, you can proceed if affected parties allow you to proceed, and that's called a notification process where council will notify specific affected parties. It could be a direct neighbour or somebody they think that is affected. And other times they'll say, actually, you're affecting the whole community. We're going to have a full notification of the whole community. So this is the development process of getting a resource consent, which is the precursor to going through and getting the detailed building consent for what you're going to build. In Auckland, we have the Auckland Unitary Plan zoning, and the Auckland Unitary Plan zones are what I'm going to use as examples, quick examples tonight for how zoning affects what you can do on a site. So some quick zoning examples. I'm going to use the Auckland Unitary Plan and go from high to low density and just show you images of sites I've been working with. So I showed you these two last week. This is a terraced housing and apartment building zone area. It's number 2 and number 4 Farringdon Road in Glen Innes. And so this is high density, and it allows me to do the 6-story building on the right, or this 3-story building, sorry, 6-story building on the left, or the 3-story building on the right. Now it's curious because I went through the full planning process of the building on the right and sent it to Simon, got Simon to agree that it was compliant. And then I did a spreadsheet, and after doing a 500-line spreadsheet using a QS and a builder, really getting into the detail of it, I worked out that building on the left was going to cost 20 million to build, including land, for 36 units. And so then I went back to the drawing board because it wasn't going to make any money. It made about $3 million on 20 million, which is terrible, 20 million cost. So I went back to the drawing board and came up with this design on the right, and I got 29 units, and it's about 13 million cost, so 7 million less, and it makes about 18 or 19 million plus GST. So almost the same revenue out of that topology on the right, and it makes $5 to $6 million depending on what contingency I use. So I'm making double off less on the right. So with these zones, you've got to go through and do cost volume profit analysis, really get down to the nitty gritty and work out what's going to make more. And sometimes you spend a lot of money doing this. I've spent at least 20 grand designing that building on the left, talking to a QS, working out what it's going to be worth, working out what it's going to cost me, and then abandoned it and thought, well, I learned something. That doesn't make any money. And then I restarted it, and I've got something that's working quite well on the right there. So that is terraced housing and apartment building zone. So another zone in Auckland is the mixed housing urban zone. This is medium density, medium to high density. And you can see this is a 3-level building, and it's 165 meters going up vertically, and there's a unit at the bottom and a 2-story unit on top. And so each terrace is actually 2 dwellings. And in the preceding example, each of these vertical terraces on the right here is actually 1 unit. So it's unit 1, unit 2, unit 3 as you go up the terrace. And this one here is a bed studio down the bottom and then a unit on top. And so by using the airspace, instead of using it for 1 dwelling, using it for 2 or even 3 on the previous example, you start making a lot more money because you're diluting the land cost. It's the concept, you're reducing the land cost, because instead of having a 70-meter piece of land for 1 3-story dwelling, you've got a 70-meter piece of land for 2 dwellings. So the cost of that land is halved. And if you put 3 dwellings there, it's cut into a third. So as you get into these denser zones, you can dilute your land cost down and make a lot more money. Here's another example of exactly that. This is that's actually Waimumu Road. That's mine. This is my Clayburn site, and it's an early render of it. I decided to go for brick as the cladding, but anyway, if you look here, you can see these terraces, and we're using medium density zoning here. And again, by splitting the buildings in half and having a unit downstairs and a double-story unit on top, I'm diluting my land cost, and I just get a lot more yield out of the site. If I had a 3-level unit on that site, it would probably be worth 860,000 out there in Glen Eden. And as a unit underneath and a unit on top, I'd probably get 495 for the basement unit, and maybe I'm going to say 750 for the one on top. So you're getting 1.25 million off the same amount of construction. It's still the same size building, but you're getting another $450,000 out of the same dwelling. So splitting units horizontally and vertically like this gives you a much higher output in terms of revenue. And the incremental cost of doing that is you're doing another kitchen, another bathroom, and some sound rating and some fire and acoustic work to fire insulate and meet code. But that might cost you another 60-70 grand, and you're getting another 450,000 off the site. So this is a significant opportunity for you when you start to take these ideas and run them across New Zealand. You make a lot more if you start going into medium and high density. That's the very exciting thing that is coming to areas that are embracing these medium density residential standards that Simon's going to tell us about. This is a 2-level mixed housing suburban zone in Auckland, which is medium density, and these are terraces, but 2 levels, just an example. And then you get to the very bottom of the density food chain, low density, and these are freestanding houses on their own bits of land. That beauty on the bottom left there is Rawson Street, that's mine. And we bought that at mortgagee sale, or I think it might have been pre-mortgagee, but anyway, the vendor to us had dragged those 3 relocatable houses on there and then given up. And my business partner down there and I finished the houses and put garages in, and they're tenanted. And it's actually come up quite nicely. But it's a good example of low density because you've got freestanding houses on their own, relatively large titles. That's 1,300 metres. And from a planning perspective and from a development perspective, that's terrible use of land. You can put a whole lot more on that than 3 houses. And on the right, there's a mountain villa, random mountain bungalow, I think it is, on a nice piece of land. That's what you get out of single house zones. And I guess the point is that councils have been producing this sort of thing since 1950s, and many New Zealand councils believe that this is the way we should live, and it is a great way to live. Your kids grow up with a big backyard, and it's a nice way to live. The problem is that with land prices rising so high, it becomes very unaffordable, and it doesn't provide affordable housing for everybody or meet everybody's needs in the community. And so Auckland Unitary Plan came in recognising this, and we've seen these much denser rules come in. Now, one of the keys to the high density in Auckland under the Auckland Unitary Plan was a rule that said if you comply with all of the development controls, or nearly all of them, and show sufficient amenity, they won't restrict you on a maximum number of dwellings per site. So this density rule disappears if you can tick all of the other rules. And
just on that map, the single house one technically doesn't apply, but everything else does. So, there are a couple out clauses in the single house one, but everything else, you're right. You can just, as long as it's a good quality scheme, you can get consent for retest or stuff.
So single house under, you can put a 65 metre minor dwelling on the back or something. Is that right? Yeah.
Correct. Yeah.
So key takeaway here is Auckland recognised that if you could show that it was a nice place to live and that you're taking all the development controls, then they didn't need to restrict you to having 3 dwellings or whatever the rule is for the particular zone, because actually, if you can get 20 on there and it's a nice place to live, but you're producing 33-metre studios in the suburbs or whatever it is you're doing, well, actually, you're meeting a need in the community, which is a cheap, small house. And so that's the idea of that's one of the ideas of intensification, is allowing different types of product for different people in the community that are not being served by big backyards and expensive freestanding townhouses. So, and that really has enabled a transformation of Auckland, and there's been an increase of supply. Lots of good things are coming out of it. This is an example of it. This is my Bowbank Road site out in West Auckland, which I sold. And before the unitary plan was in place, I got this consent for 4 dwellings. And that was, essentially freestanding townhouses. And I think the rule out west was 1 house per 350 metres. And so that's what you got when you have a density rule. But along came the unitary plan in 2013, and it was notified in 2016, meaning it operated in 2016. And in 2016, I applied to have this intensified using the unitary plan rules. So instead of having these 4 freestanding houses, I got this. And so I put the parking out the front, 1 park per house, and I got consent for 9 dwellings in the same place that I had 4. And so this basically complied with all of the other development controls, so there was no density rule applying. And so I got these units, terraces, approved. And that is the unitary plan in action. So let's go big picture here. And I guess what I would say is New Zealand does not have a land shortage. And in cities like Rotorua, you can see it. You drive in there, and there is a terrible housing shortage, but there's plenty of land. Everybody's got 700 to 1,000 metre sites with single houses on them. So it's not a land problem, exactly the same way as it wasn't a land problem in Auckland. It's actually a zoning problem. Now, when Auckland formed the super city and amalgamated the 4 councils that were here, they reformed and brought in the Auckland Unitary Plan because the mayor at the time recognised that intensification was the way forward. So they brought in these quite revolutionary for New Zealand town planning rules, the Auckland Unitary Plan. And it's gone very well. I think Auckland is a role model for how you can consult with the community well and bring in well thought through rules, litigate them with the community, discuss and consult them with the community, tweak them. They brought them in over 3 years. They did a really good job of consulting with the community, and I think Auckland got a good outcome. And so that, I think, got picked up by Labour, and they have brought in the RMA changes, forcing high density into the district plans across many New Zealand councils, which is our discussion tonight. Pretty much what's happening is Labour are taking the high density rules and good planning model that Auckland has done and forcing it across many of the councils in New Zealand that are dragging the chain on introducing high density zoning. These rules, when they came in, got cross-house support in 2021, with National and Labour both supporting them. It was Nicola Willis and Megan Woods, wasn't it, Simon, that got together. And they designed the rules, which Simon's going to tell us about tonight, with a 2-year phase-in. So we're at the back end of that now. The rules are supposed to start operating next year. And they have features like no parking requirements and similar or denser zones than the Auckland Unitary Plan. So these rules are basically, they have been forced upon the councils. The central government has said you council must do this if you're a nominated council. And so all of the councils have gone through their planning processes. Some of them have been quite successful and have embraced it. Others are resisting it. Simon's going to tell us about that. In 2023, National are backing away from a lot of the reform pre-election. And there's a lot of uncertainty about these rules. So what's going on? Where is all this at? he's the man himself. I'd like to introduce you to Simon O'Connor, who's a town planner with Sentinel Planning. Simon's also an active investor like myself and experienced property developer. He's got Auckland Council experience. He's an ex-principal planner there, and he has over 20 years experience as a town planner. Simon, welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for the going through the process of what planning sort of is, and those great examples you had. It's always interesting to see, as time changes, what opportunities arise, and that's what we want to go over today, with regards to what council is doing, and also with regard to what central government is doing. As you said before, Labor and National got together and brought out some changes, looked at replacing the Resource Management Act with a number of other acts. So what the government has done, they're looking to replace the Resource Management Act, which is the high-level planning and environmental legislation in New Zealand. It's been lambasted from all sides since 1991 when it came out. They're looking at replacing it with 3 acts. One is called the Natural and Built Environment Act, NBA. It's not the Basketball Association. The other one is called the Spatial Planning Act, and the one that's lesser known is the Climate Adaptation Act. The Natural and Built Environment Act effectively looks after consents, whereas the Spatial Planning Act looks at more policy type direction. So the precipice here is that the Resource Management Act is too hard, it's too slow, it's too cumbersome, and it's not user-friendly. Now, I wouldn't disagree with that. It has its place. It's 30 plus years old now. It's a lot of it is, to be honest with you, it comes down to interpretation of the people interpreting it, and also the direction from the government. So the government's looking at these 3 acts to replace it. And if you look on the left-hand side of the little box, it talks a little bit about what will be coming through. They're looking at changing what we call, and Matt and I will chat about this in a bit more detail, the activity statuses of different applications. So when you make an application to council, it's given an activity status, and that means sort of how much control or discretion council has in considering the application, and it limits them to what they can assess. There currently are 6 under the RMA, Resource Management Act. There are 6 different types. They're shortening that down to 4, being permitted, which means you can just do it, you don't need consent. Controlled, which basically means the council will look at certain matters, but they would grant consent. They have removed restricted discretionary, which was used for lots of infill houses that Matt went through. They would not typically all be restricted discretionary activities. They have retained discretionary, which basically means everything's at council's discretion rather than just certain factors. They've got rid of what's called non-complying, and they've kept prohibited. What it means, though, is that with the legislation they've created, for anything that's controlled, it would almost certainly be what we've been non-notified. But things are discretionary. It brings notification back into the mix a lot more. So one of the concerns across the planning industry is that notification becomes a lot more on the table with this new legislation that's coming out. It's also a lot more wordy and detailed than the Resource Management Act. It's
notification means a forced public consultation process, with neighbours and affected parties. And are you saying that they're pushed into full notification of everybody, or do they still have the ability to do limited notification? Or is it unclear?
One of the things that's come through with all this process is it's significant change. And with the Resource Management Act, a lot of this got teased out in the courts and in the councils. So a lot of it's up in the air at the moment, and the risk is that the planning industry is seeing is that notification will become quite the norm. So what that does, it adds cost to an application, adds time, it adds uncertainty, and it allows neighbours to potentially use what we would call NIMBY reasons to look to prevent a development coming forward. So there is a lot of uncertainty with this new act and what it brings. There's been a lot of opposition and questions raised by professional institutes, but a bit like when the government rolled out the MDRS, which is the medium density residential standards, it did it at speed without a lot of consultation and enforced them on the wider community, much to the horror or disdain of architects, planners, and urban designers. So there is a new system coming, and the government is looking to rush that through the House pre-election.
Are they going to get it through? But less than 100 days now. Are they going to get it through?
That's what I've said. The first two, I don't believe the Climate Adaptation Act will go through, but I understand the Natural and Built Environment Act and the Spatial Planning Act, the government intends to push through before, under urgency or whatever, however they want to do it before the election. So
I'm interviewing Nicola Willis next month for my election build-up, and I'll ask her about this. I'm going to dig into this. I mean, that's disgraceful that they would push it through just before the election comes in. They should leave it to the next government to review it, because otherwise the next government will just repeal it.
Correct.
Yeah,
they should take on board the commentary of the people in the industry, and look to see whether it really works, because you do find central government come up with ideas and they just don't work in practice, and they just cause us all headaches. And that has in part been the response to the MDRS rules, which came out just over a year ago, which has ended up just being a real fight between local and central government over who has power to decide what is appropriate in each area. And we will talk about that a little bit in some of our later slides. So there's great concern with regard to the new rules that have come out and how they'll be interpreted, and also the notification is a big factor. One of the matters which has come up is the acts talk about if there is significant community input into a development, that it should be notified. So what does that mean? Does that mean if the locals get a petition together, that's significant input? Or does it mean if a local board member objects or raises a concern, is that input? So there's real risk that the cost of developing will increase under the new legislation. I think the thing just to temper all that though is that it will, the legislation requires the councils to replace a lot of their unitary and district plans with new documents and new rules. So it will take a number of years before this comes out. So although the government is rushing through the legislation, it's going to take a number of years before they actually start changing the rules on the ground. And we've sort of seen with the Auckland experience with the unitary plan, that can take at least 3 years, sometimes even 5 years to bed in. So that's just a matter there to again affect the timing of things as they come forward. I'll just show the next.
Sorry, Simon. Are you saying it's happening under MDRS, or is that happening under the RMA changes?
The MDRS rules, which the government introduced in December 2022, of which some had immediate legal effect for schemes of 3 or less dwellings per site where there's no qualifying matter, those are live changes. This here, the legislation will change, but it will take time to replace the unitary plans, the district plans as written, with this new plans. And there's different ways of how they look at things and how they assess things in terms of, it's not just going to be adverse effects. There's different ways of how they're going to interpret things. And generally it's becoming more, I found, more environmental friendly. And I don't say that in a good way. I say that in the sense that like ecologists have a lot more say, a lot more power in the process, which can affect the yield or the options that your development may have. So, the legislation changes will take quite a long time to roll out, with the exception of the MDRS funds, which is being pushed through at relative speed. And all the tier 1 councils, which is the large cities, Auckland plus Rotorua, have come out with plan changes with rules interpreting the MDRS, changing them slightly in their own mind to sort of take effect to what the government's meaning, but try and put a bit of local flavour on them. And this is where you've got, at the moment, a two-tiered sort of approach, or two systems. You've got the council coming out with their plan changes, looking to change things. That takes time to go through the system, the consultation, the hearings, etc. Whereas the MDRS rules, which came out a year ago, took immediate effect. So in those cases where you've got 3 or less dwellings and you don't have what's called a qualifying matter, you'll go. And a lot of developers have taken advantage of that already, and are working in that space because it's much more developer friendly than the council controls, which is this local government fight. The governments came out and said, councils, you're not very good at this. We're going to put some really permissive rules in for smaller schemes. And the councils have come back and said, with plan changes, trying to fight that. And as a developer, I prefer to work with the government's rules because they're much more friendly than the council's rules, which are still subject to change, because the council's brought in a lot of controls which make achieving a high yield more difficult. They've brought in things like tree protection areas in terms of minimum areas of a site that have to have trees on them under the guise of climate change. They've got lots of different controls in there. So you have to be really aware of what space you work in and what the opportunities are. But there's, the MDRS is kind of working quite separate to the legislation that's coming through, which is going to take time to embed and along with the plan changes.
It was pretty scary, the MDRS rules. Let's have a look at them and then talk about them anyway. I thought they were over the top when I first saw them.
Yeah, they are, Matt. And I'm interested because you're chatting to Nicola Willis in a few weeks' time, and she was one of the real people pushing for it. And look, I don't mind the rules. There's a few things that aren't great, but the height boundary control at 4 meters and 60 is pretty harsh on a neighbour, especially if you're directly to the north of them. So look, it's got some good things. It's enabling, which is what we like.
Let's talk about them and then discuss the detail of them a bit more, because I think the detail will be of interest to people. Yeah.
So just as I sort of touched on before, the MDRS rules come out, and it's a real opportunity across the country. Just in the 6 councils you see there, they've all come out with a plan change, except for Wellington, which is the whole new plan. The government's expecting these councils to make the changes or implement them, so they are live rules come around about Easter of next year, except for Auckland, which has been given a 1-year extension under the guise of we've got to look at more flooding concerns. I don't believe that personally, but it is, be fair to council, it's a massive job changing all these rules, and the timeframes are very short in terms of achieving this. So you need to be aware of these things coming forward, because they will effectively, in the area that you develop or live in, these are the likely rules that the council will bring through, which run slightly independently to the MDRS rules, which are for 3 or less dwellings, that will basically determine what opportunities you have going forward. I do, Matt, just want to touch on qualifying matters here, because that's a real sticky point, a real interesting thing. Qualifying matters are things that prevent the MDRS from going live or you being able to use them on your site. And the different councils, some councils have been quite enabling and others have been quite restrictive. So we'll just shoot on to the next screen, actually, next slide, because it does say in a bit more detail. So, Auckland Council generally got behind the government with the MDRS rules, and they brought out what's called Plan Change 78, which looked to address them. It did look to de-intensify or create additional rules that made it harder to do what the government rules were sort of providing. So that's sort of this sort of fight between local and central government over who's got control. And what Auckland Council did is they brought out some what I call questionable qualifying matters. Qualifying matters are things like floodplains, overland flow paths, things that may prevent something going live, but they incorporated things like volcanic view shafts, which are 80 meters above your height of your site, which has got no relevance to an 11-meter high limit, or that Auckland Airport's got a flight designation 2 kilometers over your site. They've used these mechanisms or tools to prevent the more permissive government rules coming forward or being able to be enabled. So that really affects all of South Auckland and sort of half of the old Auckland city area. So it's almost like council's response to try and throttle the opportunities that the MDRS rules created, just because they effectively don't like them, because it's this fight between local and central government over who's got the power over it. I don't
understand it, to be honest, because I live in Mission Bay, or I did when I had this conversation, last year I was in Mission Bay in Auckland here, and I lived on a slope, and my property looked straight out and I could see Rangitoto. And the zoning of everybody in front of me was single house zone, quite restrictive, and my zoning was single house zone. Now, under the first cut of MDRS, a bunch of houses in front of me were upzoned to mixed housing urban, which is 3 level. And if one of those houses picks up on that zoning and goes from 2 level to 3 level, they cut the views out of the house behind it. And so a domino effect happens. Everybody up the hillside has to build up to recapture their view. And so just bringing in rules and saying you can go up everywhere is not necessarily the thing to do. With a bit of thought, you can say, well, in flat areas, fair enough, but in areas with sight lines to volcanoes and the sea, you're actually stealing people's view, which might be worth $2 or $3 million in Auckland. That view could be worth even more than that, and you're taking it. And I found it incredibly arrogant of the government that they would just make a rule for all sites and slap it on the councils and say, you have to do that. And they are doing huge damage to people's net worth and causing mayhem in the streets and through the change of planning. So I thought Auckland got it right, because we had a 3-year, very slow phase in of Auckland Unitary Plan. The council planners went through it street by street. They thought about it and they consulted the community, and they did it right. This government's not good at consulting, and I'm surprised that Nicola Willis was, behind it. As a developer, I love it, because I can go and trash other people's views and do what I want as fast as I can. But I just don't think it's good quality evolution of town planning standards in a city.
I agree with you, Matt, and it was rushed through by government at the end of 2022 in a 6-week period.
Rushed, just slammed through like the tax changes, just no consultation, And not that I'm biased.
The danger here, Matt, and your point is completely valid. In certain areas where the amenity is the view, you effectively change everybody. So everyone has to respond to someone else in front. And that is one of the dangers with the current live rules, is that person in front of you could, if there's no qualifying matter, right now do 3 stories and block your, and then block your view for 8%. Then you think, well, what's the future of my site? And then you start doing it. Even if a change of government occurs and these rules get thrown out, there's 1 or 2 people that have just popped up and taken over the space. Yeah. It was very ill thought and rushed. In some areas it's quite good, but in some areas it's really bad.
I should have said 3 years. Do what Auckland did. Do a good quality deep dive into it. Consult your community properly. Set up local, boards. Put a judge on it that you can refer it to. What's that called again? Where you
they just get it like a hearing commissioners or panel effectively to review it. That's what planners, urban designers, etc.
So little wonder that cities are pushing back, saying we haven't been consulted. We're here for a long time. You're here for a short time. We'll talk to the next government. That's what they're doing, isn't it? They're pushing back on these rules, saying, they're finding qualifying matters to slow it down. Then they'll consult with the next government. I think that's what's going on, isn't it?
And I think that's what, in this list here, what some of the other councils have done. Hamilton effectively rejected and said, anything, we value what we've got. They're quite different to Auckland. Hamilton, they've got, more land, which is not too far from the centre, which is greenfield or which is available. They don't have the demand from commercial or the transport to really sort of, or they're not big enough effectively to really support it. So they effectively rejected it with them there, and they've come out with a plan change, which looks to, again, throttle the MDRS standards by imposing qualifying matters, which they reasonably successfully have done. They can, because councils can put qualifying matters, introduce a new item which prevents the MDRS coming forward. Auckland didn't do it, and they've interpreted some quite uniquely, which is we've actually got a hearing with council next month on that with a few lawyers, which will be fun. But every council's responded differently. Hamilton, to be fair, they're looking at 3 to 5 stories around their suburban centres, which is not MDRS, it's the There's another one which we loosely call walkable catchments, which is looking to intensify around really built up areas. In Auckland, it's looking at 6 stories, but Hamilton are looking slightly less. So they're looking at other opportunities. Tauranga, as an example, reasonably permissive with the DRS controls, not many qualifying matters. Again, they've got a plan change out to look at their response to the government's direction. Rotorua, Matt's got a lot of knowledge in that area.
Yeah, I edited your slide and put that in there. So we're getting medium density right across RDC and high density close to the city centre, which is loosely what everybody's doing, but it's actually very permissive and it's quite encouraging. From my architect is showing me some very high density layouts of my sites down there. So I think Rotorua is embracing it quite strongly. It's pretty flat down there, so I don't think it does too much damage to go high density when you're on flat zones.
Well,
It'd be interesting to see how they get on with their utilities and services, because they just don't have enough, So
yeah.
Where do we put our stormwater? Where do we put our sewer? Everything's going to be at capacity fairly quickly. So for me down there, first cab off the rank's going to get to do it, and you'll use all the power of the street and all the stormwater and sewer, and then it'll become more difficult.
Yeah, I mean, what Auckland Council, Matt, and we had a discussion about 18 months ago when this first came out, and we saw these opportunities of single house zones becoming MDRS and being able to go 3 dwellings per site. And the council eventually figured out, this is not a good thing. And then they put these qualifying matters on, which were things like infrastructure. So the whole of the Hibiscus Coast in Auckland, or most of it, has got a qualifying matter of a lack of infrastructure, which makes complete sense. But that is kind of the response that the council had to do, as a result of the government changes. And to be fair, there's a couple of areas I've missed, which are great for developers, and we'll talk about that at the end today. But there's been just a mixed response of how things come forward. I'll just touch on Wellington, again, pretty liberal with regard to things coming forward. Maybe it's because they've got government in there over the back fence, so they can't be too combative. And Christchurch, effectively rejected them and said, we're not doing it. And they've brought out Plan Change 14 just recently, which is their response. And they put a catch-all qualifying matter called access to sunlight, which effectively means that anything, any development that wanted to use MDRS, if it has a window, the MDRS don't apply. So you can get creative with how the government throws a few punches, council throw a few back, and it's a bit of a race to the bottom because the outcomes aren't great. I mean, one thing I've also about Christchurch is they're actually really efficient in terms of their report writing and preparing applications. Like here, you'll get a 30-page response from councillors, the reason why it's okay. In Christchurch, it's 6-7 pages, and the consenting costs are about a third to half. So, a big tick to Christchurch in that sense. But that
I just did a building consent for a home theatre room in my house. It cost $35,000 to get building consent in Auckland. It was a shit fight. So I can't say that I'm loving Auckland Council right now.
No, I have a bit of a love-hate relationship as well. Some good people there. They do some things well, they do some things not so well.
$35,000 for consent. It's just for consent. The room's only 35 metres. So.
That's madness.
There was architect as well.
Yeah. One thing I want to go through to Matt is choosing the right property developer. And you've obviously, Matt's got experience from an accounting perspective as well as number crunching, which is really critical. But also just if you understand the planning rules, which come back to, as Matt said at the start, what opportunities the site has, how you could develop it. Matt uses 3-story and a 6-story example, fleshing them out, understanding what sells in the area. So there's, and I guess then also you've got a planning assessment and engineering assessment to make sure you don't get caught out, and buying the wrong site. So, you've got to make sure the sites are large enough. Historically, there've been minimum lot sizes, but as we've found with the Auckland Unitary Plan and what is looking to be rolled out across most of the other Tier 1 councils, is density is disappearing. If you come back with, say, 3 smaller houses that are as big as 1 big house, what's the issue? It's the same number of people during living there. You're just providing more affordable housing options for people who haven't, got the money to build and live in larger projects, larger sites. So, when you're looking at a development site, there sort of are some minimum sizes. Generally, we find most sites are sort of that 800 squares, kind of like your starting point, unless you're looking at using an MDRS where it's 3 dwellings per site, and you can start going, say, 3 terraces on 500 square, and sites of wide frontages or corner sites start becoming really good.
And then layering the terraces up the terrace as well. So you can subdivide vertically, but you can also subdivide horizontally. So where there's 1 terrace, you can get 3 units.
And the big change that's
enabled that. Yes, and if you've got 5 terraces, that's 15 units potentially. I think that is a massive opportunity to when you start doing the maths on that, those developments get a lot more profitable. Yeah, and DRS is enabling that, isn't it? Across the country.
It is. MDRS certainly. Well, it's heading in that direction. MDRS has said only does 3 dwellings per site, but the unitary plan, other things at the moment, they enable that. The biggest change there was the government's removal of minimum parking standards, because parking standards for a long time, 2 parking standards per site, effectively meant you had to have so many parking spaces that it kind of was a quasi density control anyway. Yeah. So with no parking requirements, you can do, as Matt said, that arrangement where you're stacking one on the other. Upper floor dwellings just have a balcony but don't need large areas of land. So it just opens more options.
We haven't really talked much, Simon, about the detail of the government's recommended development controls for MDRS. Should we just pause and briefly talk about that? So, for example, height in relation to boundary, I think you said 4 meters and 65 degrees, is it?
4 and 60, which is very permissive when you look at the current ones of like 2.5 and 45 degrees or 3 meters and 45 degrees. Effectively, it means you can get an extra story much closer.
Yeah, 1 meter side yards. So you can put a 3-story building 1 meter off the boundary.
You can put a 2-story 1 meter boundary, put a 3-story 3 meters off the boundary, whereas previously a 3-story would be, say, 6 meters away.
Yes.
So you're pushing the massing onto the neighbours. And
shadowing them and changing their sight lines and all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's no comeback. It enables 11 meters of height, so 3 stories quite easily rather than 2. Very permissive in terms of building coverage of 50%, increasing generally from say 35 or 40%. Only 20% landscaping down, which is half what you had before.
No parking.
No parking requirements. Minimal outdoor space. Very developer friendly, not quality friendly to be honest with you. Outdoor space can be south facing. So really, to be totally honest, amateur hour by central government, rushing it out, not thinking it through.
Foul is how I describe it. Let's create foul living environments and not care. It's not good. Yeah.
It's and it comes down, the developer then has absolute discretion as to whether they're going to impose massing on the neighbours, and you said in your Mission Bay example, versus actually something that's quite nice. So it isn't good planning. It's not good for the city, but it does a few things that kind of steer in the right direction in terms of opening up, getting rid of density and opening up other options for people coming forward. The rules, and that comes down to the zoning, but further down, the MDRS rules, if they are live, that's a factor to consider. So let's go at the top of this of the slide here. Getting a site that's large enough, as Matt's gone through, looking at the cost to profit balance on options. In terms of a layout, what works in terms of ease construction and buyer appeal, in terms of getting the right fit for the market. You don't want to, for argument's sake, look at a high-end St Heliers place, for argument's sake, and do a whole lot of 2-story small units just because the density is there. You've got to understand what the community would buy. Sort of understanding from a hazard and servicing perspective, looking at flooding. Flooding can be a real development, showstopper. And councils are getting more conservative in that. So if there's a floodplain in your area on the site, really understanding whether that has significant consequences to what you're doing. And then more recently, things like coastal inundation or future coastal inundation, which looks at climate change and matters coming forward in that space. So they're just further restrictions that can affect your yield. Streams have become a real big issue. If you've got even an overland flow path that kind of looks like a stream. So whenever you see water or anything could be a stream on site, councils are generally wanting a 10-metre separation. And the new legislation being brought out by central government in the the NBA Act looks at being more restrictive and giving more power to ecologists to protect or have greater distances between developments and streams. So it's just an understanding of what's coming through in that space. Also,
an example of that is that Claiborne site that I just had on the screen before. There's a stream in the backyard that's actually a drain, but it's a council drain that sort of trickles through the site. But you know, we agreed with council that we could build 4 metres off it, and we'll do some plantings in the riparian margin up to the edge of the stream. It's only an inch thick, you know, drain / creek, but council's treating it like this ecological special environment that fish might live in. They'll never live there. But if it gets protected, and under the proposed changes, Simon, you were saying to me that I'd have to build 10 metres away because it's all or nothing, right?
Yeah, it's much harder as council, the new legislation is using the word avoid a lot more. You know, so it's giving legislation that is less permissive.
So rather than me planting that riparian margin,
trade things off, trade off the top. You used to say, well, hey, I can give you 10 metres of grass and you can have nothing, no ecological planting, which is what developers are going to do. They can give them the bit of the middle finger, put a fence there and just leave this grass, which is not a win for the ecologists either. But
instead of council saying to me, well, you show me a landscaping plan to do something nice with that land, and we'll let you build 6 metres closer because actually there's no benefit in being 10 away, 4 is close enough in this environment. So developers happy, communities happy, council's happy, good trade-off. They're taking that discretion of council away and saying it's all or nothing.
Correct. That's the concerns coming forward from the new legislation is the overall net benefit, the win-wins, which that is, and that Claiborne wants, 4 metres was very impressive. Normally it's hard to get, under 60 days, but, we can, those trade-offs, those discussions we can have for mutual benefits are going to disappear.
I went for putting the pipe through it and bulldozing over the top of it, but you told me I couldn't do it.
Trying to keep you out of court, Matt. I mean, the other thing is just to look at with regard to properties, just understanding the zonings, which is what we've talked about today. What the options are. Matt's giving you a great presentation on how to consider things there and what opportunities there are. The MDRS is something to factor, which is the 3 or less dwellings per site. If there's no qualifying matters, there's a couple of real gems of sites you can get them, especially in high value areas, where you might find a 600-metre site, a nice wide frontage or a corner site, and you can put three-story terraces in there with great views, and hopefully it's not in front of Matt's place and blocking his view. But those opportunities are there. The big question in the MDRS space, with obviously, and Matt will probe or question this to Nicola Willis in the coming weeks, is the National Party at Christopher Luxon at the lovely the Birkenhead Residents Association, which is actually scrapping myself and my client on a scheme in Zion Road, all get up in arms about intensification, and Christopher Luxon said, the National Party prefer sprawl and would consider removing or changing the MDRS. So that just creates uncertainty. It means a lot of people are rushing through applications now. So government planning rules can change real quickly on government knee-jerk reactions, whether it's implementing the MDRS or even removing it.
Yeah, that's not the answer either, is it? What the answer is, copy what Auckland did, do a good community consultation, slow it down, and think about it deeply, and consult the community and let them push back. You get a better quality outcome. Just take the time. Yeah,
I agree, Matt. I think the Auckland Energy Plan rules have been, generally well received. They've been copied in Whangarei. A couple of places have copied the rules, copied the zones. But a lot of when the government's coming in to changes, just create uncertainty, but also they create opportunities. But it depends how you look at it. For neighbours, it's bad. For developers, it's probably generally good. For everybody, it's probably could be a heck of a lot better. Just another thing is to look at when you're looking at property, there's overlays. It's the last thing down there. Things like character areas, ecological areas. There are restrictions on top of the zoning which can prevent things coming forward, and sometimes down zone something. So you can have a zone, but you can have an overlay or a precinct plan which just sits on top of it and you have to consider those factors as well in your opportunities for a site. So a good example there might be somewhere like Long Bay in Auckland, where the council went through a very detailed process of developing effectively the whole suburb, and it brought out very specific rules. And so those rules sit on top of the underlying of the zoning rules that the council brought out, because they're site specific. So overlays are things that are, something that's unique to the site, whether it's a volcanic view shaft, we said before, which is, can cause problems, or it's ecological areas, whether it's a special character area, like, quasi-heritage buildings, or if there's a master plan.
Ponsonby Precinct, for example, the heritage overlay in there is very annoying on my Jubilees roadside. What is that? Because I would have thought MDRS would have trumped that, but it hasn't, has it?
It hasn't trumped it, no. So MDRS can still apply, but if you've got like, that would be a character character area is a qualifying matter, so that effectively prevents you from bringing it forward. There are some sites though in characters areas which have been the character areas not been brought forward. So you can use the MDRS there, but you've still got to consider you can't just demolish as of right still. So there's factors and degrees of how you do things going forward. We might just flick through to the next one here, Matt. There's lots of mechanisms which we've talked about here of how you can make money, because that is what most of you are here to do. I don't think it's a community consultation meeting or a council sort of discussion. So what are the opportunities that planning and development sort of offers in terms of things coming forward? And a plan change where some land for zoning is changed, usually it goes, the term upzoned is used, and upzoned means we're making it more intensive. So if you're taking a farm and making 600 metre lots, for argument's sake, that's upzoning it. Equally, if you've already got 600 metre lots, and we're looking at, say, mixed housing urban, which is maybe no density, 3-storey, that's an upzone as well. So the council will bring through a plan change. They can be private plan changes led by developers. They're a slow process, sort of take two to 4 years generally to come through, but that's a way of looking to get ahead. And people often land bank or buy larger sites on the edge of built up areas, thinking, hey, this might change later on. So that's a common strategy of what could come forward. Obviously, we talked previously about the MDRS as being an upzone option. One thing that's popped out, Matt, about 8 weeks ago, and has got a lot of the development community concerned in the Auckland area, and it can happen, I think it can happen also in other areas. It's this battle again between central and local government, and because the government brought out the MDRS and the direction to look to create more development in the intensive areas around the centres, it means that there's less pressure on the periphery to bring land forward for the more spread out type developments. And Auckland Council had identified, in this case, and some other councils, future urban zones, which is basically saying, hey, look, in 20 years' time for this area or 10 years' time for this one, we're going to provide a mechanism to bring this land forward through road connections, through infrastructure, through demand that will make this land available. It could be for residential, or it could be for industrial, for argument's sake. And what council did 2 months ago is they brought out a 2023 future land strategy, effectively downzoning these future urban areas. And I take it's on the basis that there's other areas are coming forward, but the need's not going to be there. So people have bought land, greenfield land or periphery land, looking to land bank for things in the future, and councils just pull the rug under their feet, partly under the guise of flooding as well. If it's like Drury,
they're doing that out on the Drury periphery and coming back.
Takanini is the big one where I look at one. I've got a client, we're putting in a notified application in very quickly, where it's half a mixed housing suburban zone and half future urban, surrounded by residential properties, and it's got a very shallow floodplain. But we're going to have to push that through, go through as a notified application to look to put about maybe about 60 houses in there. So otherwise, that opportunity gets lost, and it's council look at it and go, oh, it's a floodplain, but it might only be 5 centimetres deep, which is in this case, which is really inconsequential. So you have to be aware of what's coming and what options are, but there's lots of ways that effectively added value can be made on land effectively by allowing more intensification of it. The other
Simon, a couple of questions coming through here. After the flooding event, how is Auckland Council viewing applications on flood-prone areas?
More conservatively, a lot of times if you're in a floodplain area or in a floodplain area, they've made you go back and get your civil engineer to relook at the site and confirm if there's been any subsidence or any damage. We've had a couple of clients like that, have had to redesign. So yes, they're getting more conservative. You know, the council staff are just people, and you know, with anything with flooding, it's relative risk.
I imagine cliffs are being more proactive.
Oh, yeah. Cliff ones, they're being much more conservative. So you can imagine if ever you've got a flooding exercise, council are going to put on their more conservative hat. So
yeah,
it just comes down to, you know, good planning arguments, good engineers on board to design a solution that can work are still there. But you know, you will get more. Some people in council are more conservative than others and can affect what you're doing.
Lena asks, how can you check if a site's flood prone? Lena, the Auckland GIS, and most councils have a GIS, will let you put on layers, and you can actually tick the box and it'll show you what overland flow paths and floodplains exist for an area. And with Gabrielle, Simon, are those all up to date? Have they been updated, or?
Floodplains, no, they haven't. I mean, council go through a process of reviewing it on a catchment-wide basis, so there's a lot of data entry, reassessment to go on. So they could be out of date then. Well, Gabrielle was like, you know, a 100 year event, or sometimes even 200 year event. So most of the modelling was reasonably accurate. I saw the flooding out in Kumu, and it was pretty much exactly where the 100-year event was. You could put the drone photo and the aerial photo with the flooding map on it, and they were pretty much exactly the same.
Oh, yeah.
So they are looking at the ones that had more damage and looking at what they can do. And obviously, you know, areas can go from being a flood area to not being a flood area if councils do something in the wider catchment, which they're doing in a lot of areas, like lowering the heights of sports fields. So there's areas that can hold the water. So, you know, it's just a slow response mechanism to any issue that arises. Yeah, I mean, the third bullet point there is what I explained before. And as I said, we're doing this for a client rather than going for a plan change because it's future urban. We're just going in for a notified application, and it will cost less time and money than a plan change, less community input, but it will be notified. But it's still a way to push something through where it stacks up as an outcome. It's not, you know, it's not something completely pie in the sky. So that's just another process of how you can, you know, make money out of it. Because if it gets downzoned, then the site loses huge value. And if we get that consent, you know, that's a great way to add value to the land. And you showed that before with one of your sites out in West Auckland, which had 4 houses, and you came back and did 9. Now that was a rare site down a right of way, so 9's usually the maximum for parking there. But that's, you know, you've added the value to your site through gaining the consent.
And I thought it was quite livable, the design, but under MDRS it would just be nasty because there'd be no parking. So
yeah, if the MDRS was live and there was no, and you could do it for 9 houses, yes, but equally, Matt, you could have done a 1-bedroom dwelling on the bottom, your two-story terrace option above, and that 9 could well have been 16 or something like that.
I wish I'd known that, Simon.
All right, just looking over next slide, Matt.
Yep.
Again, the best areas where to, you know, for investment and development, and we've all got our areas we like. For me, an area where you've got, and this is a real site-by-site analysis, an area where the MDRS rules are live, and effectively, I would, if I was looking for a site right now, something in the eastern side of the North Shore, or a high value area, or St Heliers Mission Bay in front of Matt's house, as I said, getting a site where you can do 3 stories on, say, 600 square, where it can work. There's some real gems there. There's lots of areas in Remuera, which you know, larger sites that were single dwelling house zones, or where there's no qualified matters of infrastructure or anything. There's a couple of gems out there, but they are harder to find. You're really going to look forward to find those. But I do think location is really critical, because at the end of the day, the cost for a pipe, the general cost of building per square metre is the same, whether you're building here or there. you'll do a higher spec in nicer areas, but the sale price or the end value, makes a big difference as to your site selection and where you choose to purchase. I do think the new rules will add more incentive to higher value areas in terms of becoming more desirable. And we've also seen a bit of pushback from certainly with investors not looking at the two-story, two-bedroom townhouses or terrace houses as options, and people looking now for slightly larger houses as first-time home buyers, because they are back in force. But not developers, or not this best for my business, but they are certainly out there, and we are seeing good houses being very aggressive at auctions in terms of what people want. Examples of areas to look at. Terrace Peninsula in recent times in Auckland was a great example, because it went to the terrace housing apartment zone, and it was just gangbusters there, where every developer in every street was doing something. I think it's no parking or very low parking, and it's pretty tough now in terms of everyone's developed in the area. So what was good, now it's been filled out. You can't park your car on the street.
It's overdeveloped.
It's overdeveloped, 100%, and it's not that accessible. It hasn't got great public transport. So a couple of examples I've given there: Greenhithe, Wellsford, and Warkworth, all single house zone sites that typically don't have qualifying matters. So you can go in those sites, and the bigger sites, and do 3 dwellings per site. And that is under MDRS. And what I love about the MDRS in these bigger sites is it's 3 dwellings per site. So what you can do, you can create 600-meter sites in the single house zone, and you could, if you wanted to, put 3 houses on it. So you could be going from say a 1,000-meter lot down to or say you like 1,200 square. Instead of doing 2, you split it 2 lots, and then you come again under MDRS and you can do 6. And that's a massive change for the likes of, say, Greenhithe or somewhere where you've got large standalone houses with tennis courts and swimming pools, where you can actually come in and do something much more intensive. We've probably done half a dozen schemes using these sort of controls, but what we've sort of found is that developers have kind of said, well, I don't think something that intense will work there, but they find that sort of happy medium, which is still a large house on, say, 400 square, but something that certainly gets an uplift. A couple of great schemes recently in Wellsford and Warkworth on the edge of the town centre, where you can just get 3 houses where you've got one, often relocatables, like examples you used before, Matt, where you've got an existing house, so you don't have to buy an extra house. You add 2; those work quite well. So those ones are out there at the moment. One thing to be aware of going forward is, through the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, there's this term which has come through most of the councils of walkable catchments, which is effectively intensification around centres. This is all subject to plan changes, so it won't have effect for at least maybe 18 months or 2 years, but it does look to enable up to 6 levels in the Auckland context. Hamilton, I think, they're looking between 3 and 5. Areas that are closer to places of employment, closer to good transport routes, that are looking at encouraging apartments. And your example, Matt, in Farringdon's a good one, where sometimes it just doesn't stack up. It really only works better in the higher value areas. And what I sort of noticed with the apartment type model for 6 stories or more, corner sites are always good. Corner sites, because you've got outlook over 2 roads. You've got you're not competing with neighbours, so to speak, so you get a better quality product on a corner. That goes with all types of development, to be fair. Avoid rear sites. Corner sites are great, and nice wide sites are also good. But with this walkable catchments, a couple of little gems I've noticed is the height to boundary controls are really permissive. So, to the site next door, and this is in the Auckland context, certainly. So you can do like 6 stories about 3 metres from the boundary, which I think is crazy. So sites 1 back from the beach become really good, because the one on the beach is going to be zoned going forward a low density, which is effectively 2 stories, 2 or 3 stories. So if you're 1 back, you get to look over the top of them. So those sites 1 back from the coast, the edge of the upzone, will enjoy the outlook over, in this case, the views that will be enjoyed over that person's property in front, who's got a very beautiful house, but much lower in height. great opportunities there. But then as you kind of come back up the street, then everyone's only kind of looking into the street. So you get this real competition almost for where your outlook, where you get your sun from. And you start getting some pretty ugly outcomes. And that's my concern with, we talked about the MDRS concerns earlier, or some of these other matters. The rules are very permissive. And when I used to work, I worked in council last time about 11 years ago, I really like to, when we're doing these things of creating new rules, working out what's the outcome going to be, how's the developer going to interpret it, so you can actually understand what you're going to get, and then you can design the rules accordingly. But what I do see if planners who don't have development experience, they come out with rules which sound great on paper, but come out with these perverse outcomes. And even worse, politicians come out with these ideas which have even worse outcomes. So, there's, as you said before, there's real detail required in terms of enabling enough or allowing enough time to go through what the rules mean, how it can be, to test them, to listen to professionals, and to try and get, on balance, the best outcomes you can. So, it depends how you look at it in terms of best ideas for development are not always the best outcome for neighbouring or the local community.
Exactly, yeah. Let's move on to Q&A, shall we? So a couple of questions here. Tony has asked in relation to flow path management, is there a responsibility for landowners to prevent discharge to neighbouring properties?
More a civil matter, to be totally honest. So I don't want to dabble in that. It's a little bit. It's more an engineering question, but most councils prevent a person from changing the entrance and the exit of an overland flow path on the site. So if you are developing, you can create a channel to have your overland flow path go around your development, but as long as the entrance and the exit are not changed. You
can't dump your stormwater on your neighbour. You can't.
Well, you can't just. You've got to connect a new dwelling to an approved stormwater discharge system, which could be a main system. It could be a curbside discharge, or in volcanic areas, it could be a soakage pit in the ground. You can't just connect your your guttering and spit it out over neighbours' property. No, It's not really a planning matter, but that's the general take on it.
Sophie asks, can we get separate titles from these three houses using MDRS?
Yes.
And I'm just going to chip in there and say, you get three titles under MDRS, but you can also use bulking and massing, can't you, and those rules to scale up to get much larger scale developments.
Yeah, the rules are much more permissive with three stories.
Can you talk about what bulking and massing is and how you do that? That's how
in terms of maximising out a MDRS type site, or
so for example, in Rotorua, I've got a 1,000-metre site with 19 units designed on it, and 9 car parks underneath them, and so I'm not using the 3-unit rule to do that, and I haven't actually connected with my architect yet, but how's he doing that?
Yeah, look, a lot of the new rules coming out in the Auckland context, the ones that have been out for a long time, as Matt said at the start, density is no longer when you're coming up with a design-led scheme, it's not a critical matter. So what it does, it basically says if you can design, say, 9 or 20 houses that generally meet the criterion and provide a reasonable outcome, then we'll ignore the density control. If you're creating a vacant site, there's a minimum lot size. But if you've got, a 1,000-metre site as an example, you can quite easily do, under the old rules of doing vacant sites, maybe 2. But if you're doing a design-led scheme, then you could look at, say, 9 on that, 9 2- or 3-story houses with a car park each, so 2 at the front, an entrance down the middle, open parking in the middle of the site, and then a row 90 degrees on the angle at the back. And then you can do what we did for your place in Claiborne and a couple others, Matt, where you could, if it's 3-story, you can then stack your units on top of each other. So you're not providing lifts here, but what you're doing is you're saying, we can do like a 35, 40 square metre ground floor studio or 1-bedroom, and we can have a walk-up unit above it, which has got the living room on the mid-floor and, for example, like 2 bedrooms on the top floor. The ground floor unit will have outdoor space. The upper floor one will have a balcony and look over the top. But that's effectively a way to double your density through that. And again, if you don't provide parking spaces, you can actually get a bit more in again. It's fun a happy medium of what actually people will actually tolerate and and rent or buy. But there are lots of ways with the new rules just to to maximize out the massing, and then look at how you effectively use the gross floor area that your maximizing options has got, how you split it up into smaller houses, bigger houses. Generally, the smaller the house, the more houses you get, and usually the more money you get.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things people can take from this workshop is you can stack small houses on top of each other, and within 3 levels only get 3 of them on top of each other, and your profit goes up. Somebody asked how many square meters are the 2-bedroom and 1-bedroom units on the example I showed. I'm aiming generically for small, so the 1-bedroom might be 45 to 50 meters, and then the 2 beds are 65. And I'm doing that because I'm trying to achieve Kiwi Build minimum requirements for 1 and 2 bedroom units. So if I get Kiwi Build minimum requirements, they're bankable, and if I get Kiwi Build under it, I get funding through Kiwi Build. So that's another layer to this.
On the flip side of that, Matt, the minimum general requirements for a 1-bedroom are sort of 45 square, or if you go for a studio, it's down to 35 square. So it depends on how many you're looking to do, but you could do a studio on the bottom and say a 75 square 2-bedroom above as your absolute minimums.
Yep, and you don't want to go too big, because if you go too big, you're not getting paid for it. Your market's only going to be able to pay you a maximum amount in an area. And if you, for example, build a 120 metre unit in an area, you won't get any more money for it. So I think that's a rookie mistake that you can make, is to build things too big and not get paid. It might be generous and it might be a nice place to live, but you're not going to get paid for the extra volume. So you've got to be careful that it's not too small and it's nasty or unbankable, but not too big that you can't make money out of it. So it's not just town planning, it's also commercial common sense. And just while we're on it, with studios and under the unitary plan, you don't need a car park, whereas with units with separate bedrooms, you do. So that
you don't need car parks on any of them these days.
Yeah, with MDRS and
the government brought out took away minimum parking standards, so you don't have to have any parking, but the removal of the parking standards is effectively what enables us to go forward, because it frees up land that otherwise wouldn't be used for parking.
Let's pause there on that, because that's interesting. So you can still apply in Auckland under unitary plan, can't you, and ignore MDRS? Right. Or do you have to? Yeah. So if you went in under unitary plan and said this is compliant, the qualifying matters and the issues with MDRS don't apply because we're coming in under unitary plan, then do you still have the parking requirements under the unitary plan, or are they gone?
Requirements in the unitary plan for residential.
Oh, okay. So both they're gone. Yeah.
They went to about February last year.
Yeah. Yep. I remember conversations with you on that. So James asks, for mixed housing urban with building coverage going from 45 to 50% under MDRS, although MDRS is not applicable yet for schemes for greater than 3 dwellings, is there a weighting given to the proposed new rules? For example, councils say 47.5% building coverage for a scheme with good amenity.
I love this question. Look, there's no weighting, so to speak, because councils say but not live, but not live rules, so there won't be any weighting process of MDRS. But as a rule of thumb, certainly in the Auckland context, there's general scope for 5% infringement over coverage, landscape shortfall. If it's a good design, if it's working on balance reasonably well, you can always get a bit more. And this is where the planner on your scheme looks to add value to your site through looking where the rules can be pushed to give you more floor area, which might give you bigger units if that's what you want, or might give you more units. So this is where I really like getting involved, because I've got a designer's developer's mindset, so I like to get into sites and really pull them apart and see where we can push the envelope within reason, still do a good outcome, and say we'll push it here but we can't go here. So if your answer is there's no real limit, it comes down to the quality of the scheme. Corner sites again are better because the massing can be argued over the road rather than neighbours. If you've got a park next door, that's less sensitive than, say, a residential house. If a neighbour's got a garage next door, that's again not that sensitive, so you can get away with theoretically higher numbers. I hate planning by the numbers. A planner looks at the effects. Most planners like that, except for one team in South Auckland which plan by the numbers, and we just have endless battles with them. I won't name the team, but that's the difficulty sometimes with council. What can be good or acceptable in one area is unacceptable in another area for just purely personal reasons. But if you want to go over by up to 5%, good planner and a good design, in most cases will get that through.
Yeah, Farringdon, we're pushing 54.9.
Yeah, we've kind of that psychological number. We're going 54.9. Yeah, exactly.
So we're 4.9 over. We're not going to push over 5 because it's
It's kind of like a little bit of a red line. If you're going more than 5% over, you've got some really unique circumstances as to why and what you're doing. But in that Farringdon example, it's got parks on a park on two sides. It's got a road on one side and it's got one neighbour. So we just have to really add the value and soften as much as we can on that neighbour in terms of landscaping, quality of build, outlook, and we can effectively push the massing onto areas that are less sensitive.
Carlos, I'm not quite sure what your questions are asking here. I'll try and interpret it. You say MDRS Plan Change 78 map. What is the prospect of this area? I think you're asking what is the prospect of Plan Change 78 becoming live? I think that's what you're asking. That map that's published. Yeah,
the map is council's take or response to the MDRS. So it's reasonably conservative for what I see, but I don't think it'll change significantly because council's done a lot of work there. There'll be a bit of change maybe in the character areas. There might be a little bit of change in terms of some of the edge areas in terms of where the infrastructure comes forward. But I think the mapping you can take as being a best effort by council. I don't expect it to change a lot. The thing to note though is that Auckland Council applied to the government to extend Plan Change 70 out instead of having to do hearings by April of next year. It's been pushed back to 2025, so which isn't a bad thing, but it allows them more time to look at it. But I think the mapping is reasonably accurate. They've gone through a long process to get there.
Max says, can you talk about Warkworth and its potential as there are massive subdivision ongoing on the Warkworth Ridge? Most of them are single house sections. Is there a market for terraced houses there and compete to Milldale area?
Yeah,
a lot more people going.
I know exactly what you're talking about. I've got two clients at the moment on that Warkworth Bridge where we're looking at standalone houses, and I said to them, hey, look, if you wanted to, you could do this. So, I mean, what the market's going to do is a little bit unknown, but I generally think, and I kind of used that Greenheath example before, you can kind of push it a little bit and not totally max it out. So if it's a standalone house, maybe you look at Terrace detached for common wall or 2 houses rather than say 3. So you could use the rules to your advantage, but maybe not make it such a massive change, because that will still get people who want to be in the area that want single houses, but they can't quite afford the large ones. They might accept the smaller ones. So it's a little bit of market research in that space on that Warkworth Ridge area. There's a whole lot of land that's come up recently for sale there. That's a great little suburb, that one. Also in Wellsford around the town centre, some of the edge ones just on the edge of the town centre are quite prime for MDRS as well. Like quarter acre sites, a house in the middle, put one at the front, one at the back. There's some good margins to be made. Equally on the bigger sites, what we often do is we would split the site up into 2. So we do say 2 500 metre lots, and then we'll come back under MDRS and say 3 on the back lot, because it's 3 per site, not original site, it's 3 per site. So by creating sites, effectively you're allowing more dwellings to come on to be created. So there's mechanisms to stage or work the system.
Nathan says, what are your thoughts on low versus medium versus high spec developments? And I'll probably answer that one, Simon. So Nathan, any development needs cost, volume, profit analysis, and you've got to answer the question, will 3 beautiful big houses make more money than 6 medium-sized houses, or will 15 units make more money? And I think one of the biggest mistakes you can make in property development is to leave that decision to other people and not actively engage with that decision yourself. And what you can do, and I've seen it with architects, is you can go to an architect and say, what can I build? And they collaborate with your town planner and with your engineer, and they come up with their idea of what you could do with the site. Now that is reflective of their experience and is not reflective of a study of numbers of how much money you make on the 3 scenarios. And it doesn't go through and say, look, 15 units makes $2 million more than a medium density or lower density option. There's no analysis in that. There's just design. And I have seen people go through very intensive developments that take up years of their life and make no money. And at the end, the architect and the planners that were involved look at them and say, oh, this is after they've charged them a lot of money. They say, oh, you're not very good at this. And they blame the client. And actually, it's probably about right, because if you're a property developer, you've got to work the stuff out. It's your job. And you've got to be part valuer, because you've got to work out what the value of stuff is, part quantity surveyor, you've got to work out what stuff costs, part accountant, because you've got to work out the tax profiles of things, part planner, part architect. You've got to coordinate all of these skill bases and work out what the most profitable scenario on a site is. And so you can't say what makes more money, low versus high versus medium spec, because it's area specific and it's based on slope and prevailing factors in the area you're working in. The real answer to that is a spreadsheet and an analysis of all of those issues. And that's your job if you're going to get into property development. And you'll lose money fast or not make it as much money as you could if you don't run that cost volume profit exercise. And of course, to achieve a good quality study on a site, not only is it a financial feasibility, but it's all of the information backing that. The valuation, the consultation of the real estate agents, talking to your planners, your architects, your engineers, and working it out. A property development is a puzzle. You've got to solve it.
One thing there, Matt, I said before with council is, one of the team is 42% of the applications being lodged. This is in the Western Bays, the Eastern Bays area where you live. 42% of the applications are revisions to previously approved schemes, where someone's decided the market's moved, or they've got it slightly wrong, or they're looking to do something slightly different. So, but it's much better to do the changes up front and spend the money up front. If you're an accountant, your financial modeler, whoever, there's lots of people that offer these services. Spend the money up front. Don't be afraid to overspend up front to get it right, because if you start the build, you can't change it.
I spent 20 grand on Farrington to work out that I was going down the wrong path. Information I had on build rates was wrong, but that's the cheapest 20 grand I could have spent. I could have spent 20 million, built it and made no money. That would have been worse. Matt asks, what are the political views of the RMA changes? Good question.
What are the
political party's view of the RMA changes?
Now it's swung, actually. So Labor are pushing it through, and everyone else, as I'm aware, as of a couple of weeks ago, have actually now turned on them. So Labor, with their majority, are looking to run the solo.
Yeah, I'm just writing that down to ask to make sure, because I've got David Seymour and Nicola Bullis, so Matt, tune in next month. What was that?
Interesting about David is the ACT Party was the only ones that actually opposed the MDRS, and actually had, to be fair, had some logical reasons why it didn't make sense, which is why it doesn't make sense. Yeah, well,
so David always has good considered opinion about stuff, but what I didn't like about his opinion, because I asked him, and he was all about Auckland, and I said to him, but hang on, I'm developing in Rotorua and Christchurch. And he blinked. He said, "Oh, guys, I'm thinking about Auckland too," because he'd been talking to Auckland town planners and Auckland Council, who were vehemently against it for all the right reasons too, But you're right. I think David's had considered it well. Simon asks, are we going to allow to build over sewage and stormwater pipes? If not, what are the solutions in Wellington, please?
And Wellington, happy to say in a Wellington context, but from my experience, when we've been looking at constructing over, and this is a civil engineering question, so I'll kind of put on my quasi civil engineering and developers hat. You can build over pipes within reason. It depends on the size, the depth of them, etc. So if you're building over a local or a public stormwater or stormwater or sewer pipe that might be 150 or 250 mil, you just have to basically have separation distance either side and take the weight, the foundations have to go 45 degrees below the depth of the pipe. So effectively taking the weight off the pipe not to damage it. So that's called bridging. So you can bridge them within reason. I found over my time, only one I've really struck problems with was I had a stormwater pipe of over 1 metre in diameter, and Healthy Waters, which is Auckland Council's stormwater division, had concerns about that because it was such a big pipe and it was quite shallow. That was, I think we ended up getting it approved about 5 years ago, but that's the only one I really had problems with. We've built over, massive big 2.5 metre pipes, but I've generally built like pressurized ones, which are like 50 metres below the ground. But for local ones, it's just a cost exercise in most cases.
Yeah, piling's a fortune. You got to shop around for it too. That you can get ripped off. I mean, a pile is a hole in the ground. You drill a hole, you chuck a cage in it, some steel, which is cheap, and pour some concrete in it. And you'll see builders trying to charge you $1,500 for a pile, and they cost about $400. So make sure you shop around on that stuff and push back. Thomas asks, after 2 years with building consent not built, is there any way to extend the building consent?
Again, I'm dabbling a little bit outside planning. You have to take effect to the building consent. So it depends what you're doing. If you've started the project, the building consent is live as long as you're actively working on it. So I had a neighbour who built over 20 years under one consent. But if, for argument's sake, you say the consent's for a house and garage and you don't build the garage after 2 years, that's separate. So you'd have to reapply for that. But as long as you've started it and you're making progress, my understanding is that you don't need a new one.
Yeah, I would ask an architect because they routinely scrap those sorts of things out, don't they? Graham asks, is there buyer resistance to properties with no on-site parking?
Chatting to my real estate friends, yes. Depending on the areas, if you've got one that's got parking, you certainly get a premium for it. It does depend. It depends on location, depends on your price. You're going to have a lower ceiling if you don't have a car park. But a lot of the people that look at having low car parking or no car park areas, you want to be the first one in the street to do it, or you want to an area where there's like a park next door. I say a park like a reserve next door, and there's some public parking. So it's very much area specific. Some areas
if you're right on a train station, if you're right on a bus stop, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, those have lived overseas. We've seen Lamborghinis and Ferraris parked in the street because it's a free parking space. So we have a bit of a complex here, I think, of having a garage and parking off street. But if it's available, it's a free parking space on the street. So until Auckland Transport come along and try and control or permit parking on the street, it's a good thing to use. The Terrace Peninsula example is where it's gone probably a bit the opposite, where everyone's relied on the parking and they've all built at the same time. And when people move in, there's no parking on the street.
Yeah, it's nasty. Tony asks, in relation to right-of-way sites, does the driveway width limit the number of builds, for example, 3.6 metres wide?
Yes and no. A single lane access in the Auckland context will allow you to do 9 parking spaces if it's not longer than 50 metres in length in terms of right-of-way. So if your driveway is 3.03, which is a common distance, or say 4.5, which is not a common one, that's still a single lane access. So that will be 9. As soon as you've got ability to put a passing bay in, or 2 lanes, which is sort of 5.5 metres or more, then it kind of opens up to a lot more, and then you start going from there to a public road width. So at 3.6, and say it's down a right-of-way, if the right-of-way is not more than 50 metres long and it's not going onto an arterial road, Generally 9 parking spaces is the magic number, or 5 houses, depending how you put the application together. That's an Auckland context, again, because what I specialise mostly in, but should give you an idea is there's always scope.
Tanya says that she's got 4 adjacent properties in Warkworth on the old State Highway 1. She thought it'd be a great development opportunity. However, she still has 600 square metres and single height dwelling limitations. Are there any ways to change that?
Single height dwelling limitations, is that a consent notice or a covenant on the title? I don't know, because that would be a civil matter.
Wouldn't she just have MDRS up there?
Might not be in it, because areas of settlement, depending where exactly it is, if it's MDRS only applied to existing urban areas. So I don't know if it's on the state highway, it may not be a urban environment. It may be, say, a countryside living zone, or which could be different. So it's hard to say without knowing the context.
Okay. Tanya, email Simon directly, get on his website. Sherry says, is there a better way to engage an engineer to inspect the site before starting for a corner flooding site? I just say yes, always talk to an engineer before you start. What would be a good square metre then, asks Tanya. To email Simon, Tanya. We're going to shut this off in a sec, so I'm just blasting through these. For an 800 metre site under mixed housing suburban zone, what are the different housing possibilities? I think it's a bit deep for this conversation.
Very, very easy, man. I can say that answer that in 20 seconds. 800 metre site. If it's 40 metres deep and say, what's that? 20 metre frontage, or 45 deep and 18 frontage, 7 80 square terraces with 1 car park each. 4 standalone 135 square, maybe 5 sort of 120 square if we start doing mixing up, say 2 and 3. So there's anywhere between 4 and sort of 7, depending how big the dwellings you want. Right. That's before we look at that stacking option as well.
Lena asks, is there any demand for the 1-bedroom units underneath my 2 up, 1 down models? Lena, there's demand as soon as you put it up inexpensively, everything at a price point, right? So you're not trying to gouge the highest price with that stuff. You're just producing a low cost product for someone at a price point. Bernie asks, how are we going in Canterbury and surrounding areas like Lincoln, Rolleston and Darfield? Do I still see value going forward in these areas, and how friendly have Selwyn, Waimakariri been? Selwyn are amazing to deal with. We got a resource consent for 81 lots in 6 weeks, and I have nothing but good things to say about dealing with Selwyn District Council. There's a lot of demand for land down there, and we sold 81 sites in a month, and I'm getting my door knocked all the time saying, have we got any more by local developers and people down there? So that's a great area to develop in, and I'll be doing more down there, Bernie. Do we have a good planner in Christchurch? I used Service down there. Service were good. They're sort of a one-stop shop for engineering and planning. They were pretty good.
Brett Giddens down at the town, I think it's called Town Planning Consultancy or Town Planning Group. Brett's a good has a very successful company down there, and they do a lot of stuff.
I think we'll wrap it there because we're not keeping up with these. So I keep popping through. So Simon, thank you very much for your time this evening and your excellent answers. So if you'd like to get in touch with Simon, this is his website, sentinelplanning.co.nz. And I use Simon as a planner. He's excellent. He's got a good team over there. So feel free to get in touch. And Simon, quick overview of your core competencies and what you can deliver.
Yeah, look, we specialise in resource consents. We lodge about 600 consents a year, which is about 6% of the Auckland market, which is the largest planning consultancy in terms of consents lodged in Auckland. We have a team of 11 planners and 3 operations people. We also do work for council. So sometimes we work for a developer, sometimes we act or represent council, and sometimes in my cases I am the developer. So we sit on either side of the fence or on the fence in that context. So yeah, we most of the stuff is Auckland, Coromandel, and heading further north. But yeah, yeah, we can cover all sorts of things, mostly consents. We can do plan changes, but our specialty is maximising the development potential of your site, getting you the most floor area, getting you the most number of units, pushing and squeezing, leaning on council where we need to lean on them, and working everything we can to get council to say yes for you.
Very good. Well, thank you for your time this evening. And if anybody would like to get in touch with needs in those areas, get in touch with Sentinel. I use them in all of my stuff. So very good. Another thing I'd like to tell you about briefly is GRA have previously recorded a property development school. It's I think it's a 7-week or 8-week course. Simon was also in that for one evening. It's pretty much everything from how to pick a site to how to do feasibilities, zoning, planning, different topologies and layouts. It's quite detailed 8-week course. It's on our website if you're interested. Jump on there. I think it's $750. It's on demand, and it's very good. So jump in there if you're interested in the development school. That's it for this evening. Thank you all very much for attending. Simon, thank you again.
Thank you again, guys.
Cheers. Good night.